Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope you are doing very well. I'm very sorry to bother you like this. I know for some people it's holiday time, and so I hope for those of you for whom it's a holiday, I hope you are enjoying yourselves and you are having a lovely time wherever you are in the world. I want to just add a few other follow-up comments, if I could, with respect to a certain film that was recently released, which is called The Irishman, which is a film directed by Martin Scorsese and stars, among other people, Robert Deniro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci. I talked a little bit about my initial impressions about the film in a separate video, but I tried my best to avoid speaking about specific details of the plot, lest I spoil it for anyone who didn't see it. So I did not talk about any specifics of the plot or specifics of the story or the construction of the film, etc. What I would like to do now, very briefly if I could, is just to now talk about my impressions by speaking about spoilers. And so this is a kind of addendum, I suppose, to the earlier video that I did. It's, again, if you have not seen The Irishman, please do not continue with this video. Please turn off this video, because I will, from this point going forward, I will be talking about spoilers. And so the last thing I want to do is I don't want to spoil the film for you. I think it's a film that, if you are interested in this kind of genre, and if you're interested in this kind of film from this filmmaker, then you should certainly do your best to try to watch it in whatever form you are able to. But for those of you who have seen the film already, I just wanted to share some other comments that I have that are specific to the film. So once again, if you haven't seen the film, please turn off this video. Hopefully you can watch the film, and then if you are interested after you've seen the film, you can come back and you can watch this video at any time. Also, if you haven't seen the film, I would, with great respect, suggest that you avoid looking at the comments section of this video below, because I have there is a possibility that there might be comments left in the video that would be with respect to specific parts of the film, and so I would urge you to not look at the comments section either until you have seen the film. Okay, so you're back, which means I can assume that you have seen The Irishman, and so you don't mind me talking a little bit about some spoilers. Okay, so I should say from the outset that I have not seen this film as many times as I've seen, say, other works by Scorsese to which The Irishman is being compared, or with which The Irishman is being compared. For example, I haven't seen The Irishman as much as I have seen, for example, Casino, or Raging Bull, or Goodfellas, or Mean Streets, or even Who's That Knocking at My Door. So I haven't experienced the film The Irishman enough, so I can't really tell you how I might feel about it upon multiple viewings. Who knows? Perhaps upon multiple viewings my view of the film might change, and I think it might. It might, whether it becomes more positive than it is now, or maybe not so positive as it is now. Who knows? Only time will tell. But I can just only give you my impressions as they exist in the current moment, which is now the end of November 2019. Also, I should say that this is not in any way meant to be a review of the film or a criticism of the film or film criticism. I'm not a film critic by nature, by profession, and so this isn't meant by me to be any kind of review. It's just a kind of, maybe, I think of it like a talk between you and I, between friends. talking about a film after we've just walked out of watching the film in the movie theater together, and we just decided to maybe get a couple of drinks, and we were just talking about the film over drinks. So that's how I feel about this particular moment. So it's a very just casual discussion, not meant to be anything, it's not meant to be a review, it's not meant to be anything groundbreaking or anything like that. It's just my simple take, if it will, which I don't think is in any way that spectacular, to be honest. But I do want to say a couple things that are just on my mind with respect to this film. So I should say that this film is I would say it's a multifaceted film from my point of view. On the one hand, it seems like a film that is very much trying to capture or achieve a kind of wide breadth of scope with regard to the story of Frank Sheeran and his entanglements and his associations and connections and relationships with certain key figures who are meant to be real-life figures from history. And the two important relationships that he has, at least as portrayed in the film, are one, his relationship with Russell Buffalino, and two, his relationship with Jimmy Hoffa. So those are the two key relationships that I think are on display, at least regarding this film. And all the other relationships and all the other emotional beats that are surrounding Frank Sheeran as a character, or that are in any way related to Frank Sheeran as a character, all seem to be revolving around the central focus of the film's thrust, which is, as I would suggest, the focus on these two relationships. And they sometimes, at least at the beginning of the film, they seem to be in unison with each other. They seem to be congenial. They seem to be in parallel with each other. But then towards the latter half of the film, this is after Jimmy Hoffa gets out of prison, and he is trying to win back control of the Teamsters Union from Fitzsimmons, and he's trying to corral all the votes, but he can't seem to get over that innate frustration and hatred he has for Tony Pro. So that therein lies part of what ends up becoming his downfall, at least according to the film, right? So in other words, the relationship that Frank has with Jimmy Hoffa and the relationship that Frank has with Russell Buffalino, they become at odds as the film progresses towards its sort of immediate climax, if you will, which is the death of Jimmy Hoffa. And I said the immediate climax because actually the film continues on after that for a considerable number of minutes with what I would consider to be a very almost heightened, almost Shakespearean level denouement with respect to Frank Sheeran and his very old age, and how he is dealing with his life as he finds it, just as he is old and dying and alone. So the focus of the film is these two relationships, I think. So therefore, I think a lot can be said that while on the one hand the film feels, or seems to feel on the surface anyway, to be a sweeping historical epic. On the one hand, we talk about Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs and the Kennedy assassination, of course, and we have Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Union, and we also have the mafia element, and Russell Buffalino and Angelo Bruno, and the incident with Joe Gallo, and whether if what happened as it's shown in the film really happened or not, and all this stuff comes out, really what happened to Hoffa, and all this stuff comes out, which is really played out in a kind of discussion of history, right? But this film, I don't think, should be seen as any kind of attempt at trying to get at a a seemingly direct, straightforward discussion of historical events. In other words, this film does not feel like it is presenting itself as being a film about history. It is a film about the emotional impacts that are set against the backdrop of 20th century U.S. history. So it's not meant to be, I think, a documentary about what happened and what the speculations that it's making about the connections between the mafia and the Bay of Pigs and the Kennedys and all this. So I don't think we are meant to take the film like this. And I think the film has almost a hazy, almost, I don't want to say dreamlike, but it does have this hazy, almost distant quality about the film, which I think works to its advantage, but it helps to alleviate this kind of tension that might exist between real history, let's put that in air quotes, real history as it exists outside of the film, and the history that the film purports to be trying to present. And this is very important too, because there is, as some of you may know, discussion and debate about what actually happened. What actually happened to Joe Gallo in Little Italy? Who actually killed him? Or was it really Frank Sheeran, as the film seems to be depicting? Or maybe the film seems to be, I should say, is it really Frank Sheeran as Frank Sheeran seems to be claiming, as the film is depicting Frank Sheeran talking about what he seemed to have done vis-a-vis the death of Joe Gallo, for instance. And the same is true for what is the anchor of the film in many respects, which is the sequence involving the death of Jimmy Hoffa. So I don't think we are meant necessarily to look at this as a kind of straightforward depiction of history or historical depiction, because of the certain elements of distance that I think are placed in the film that remove the film from a sense of immediacy. And I think that removal from immediacy gives the film less of a feeling of realism and more of a feeling of a story, if you know what I mean, of a cinematic tale. And I think that illusion is helped very positively by the use of the de-aging effects. Now, a lot has been made about this, I think, and in the news and in other media outlets, etc. Did it work? Did it not work? There are some shots that seem to be a little bit ropey. I admit it's not perfect. It doesn't look really real for some scenes. There are some moments, I think especially early on with Deniro in particular, where it looks a little bit, it doesn't look 100% real. But I tried to suggest in my earlier video that makeup doesn't have to look real to be effective. It's a total package of makeup and the performance and the mannerisms and movements, as well as the actual physical appliance that is being applied, either physically in terms of a plastic or rubber appliance, or photographically in terms of a computer applied effect, right, onto the image itself. So it all really depends on the whole package. So it doesn't have to look realistic. There are moments where the illusion is under threat, perhaps, in terms of certain body movements of Deniro. There's one bit in particular where he's seen assaulting a grocer in a grocery store, who, because he thinks that the grocer treated his daughter Peggy improperly. And so he goes out there as a bit of a retaliation and attacks the grocer, and throws him out in the street, and very violently stomps on his hand in a shot what I think is just one continuous take. That moment looks a little bit ropey, but I think we can, at least I can not forgive, but I can go along with the illusion if we remember that Frank Sheeran, as being depicted by Robert De Niro here, seems to be this huge hulking guy with a huge frame, physical frame, And so we can, at least when I see that moment, I can go along with it. And if I try to remember that way in which the film seems to be trying to depict this character of Frank Sheeran. But then going back to the discussion of the CGI, I think what the CGI does is that it does look unreal. Okay, it looks unreal because I know in my head, for instance, Joe Pesci is not this young, and Al Pacino is not this young, and Robert De Niro is not this young in real life. I've seen interviews that they're doing now. They're doing a lot of press tours, etc., a lot of publicity for this film, and I see how they look now, and it doesn't look like what they look like in many parts of the film. So I in the back of my mind, I feel a little bit of a disconnect. But that creates an interesting psychological effect on me, I would suggest, which is that it creates a sense of almost a rose-tinted look back on the past. In other words, when I think about memories and things that I remember I did when I was very young, it's very difficult for me to think about how I must have actually looked when I was like 9 years old or 10 years old. I always think about memories that I might have when I was very, very young in the body of how I look, or how I look at myself now, which is an older man. And so, in a strange way, I think The Irishman, with this real, not real use of de-aging, in an interesting way, seems to be playing with this idea of looking back, but doing it in a way that seems to be suggesting that this look back can be almost a subjective look back. In other words, Frank Sheeran is looking back on his life, and it's almost like the over-reliance, if you will, on the CGI turns into a positive, because it almost paints the whole picture in maybe a brighter light, or a positive light, or a light that might not necessarily be totally reflective of the actuality. We're not necessarily meant to believe everything we are seeing. So I think the CGI and this weird effect that it has, I think, plays to that part of the film. Now, I'm not sure if this was intentional on the part of Scorsese. I haven't heard any specific take that the director has given, apart from the information that he's given about how it was important for the characters to look younger and they had to act in a certain way, and this is all this. But it's an interesting choice. It's a really interesting choice. Why would the choice be made to have the same actors be portraying their younger selves? It would have been just as easy, much cheaper, to have look-alike actors do this as well. I mean, it happened even with these actors, right? I mean, the famous example being Robert De Niro in Godfather Part 2. So it was, Robert De Niro played a younger Brando, or a younger Vito Corleone, and so that was a different actor. Of course, the technology probably wasn't available at the time. Of course, I understand this, but my point is that it's not an impossible feat to try to find an actor that looks similar enough to these actors to be able to portray younger versions of these characters. But so there must have been this choice. And so what actually went behind this choice? I can only surmise that based on the effect of the film that it had on me, I can say that it felt like it was trying to use this old age, young age effect in a sort of dual way. It was trying, on the one hand, on the surface, to try to look realistic, but on the other hand, if we look deeper, it felt unreal. And I think that feeling of unreality helped the illusion of the artifice of the world that the film was trying to create in The Irishman. And I say this in a positive light because I think the creation of artifice is one of the points of the film. I think that therefore the CGI is very effective. The creation of artifice, I should point out, is also helped, or it's further propelled by the fact that Frank Sheeran is the narrator of this. And it's interesting too, because after that, what now is being heralded as being a famous opening shot of that long take down the corridor of the home, and we turn and we look down, look here and then look there, and then we end up to a place where we see Frank Sheeran sitting alone in his wheelchair. We go to him and we first get his voiceover narration where he doesn't speak on camera, but we hear his words, but then suddenly we see him talk, and then he continues the conversation. We don't know who he's talking to. He's talking to us or he's talking to himself. There is no narrative setup where he's talking to someone there. And so that also begs the question, is this real or not? Is what he is saying truth or fiction? That is also indicated by the fact that he doesn't seem to be a reliable narrator. And there's for example, remember after Hoffa gets killed and it goes into the final sequence of the film, and part of the final sequence is where Frank Sheeran is talking about how they started to fall one by one. Tony Pro was in jail, but then they got him for the death of Tony Three Fingers, and there was also Russell Buffalino getting arrested, I love Frank saying, no, that was obviously it was entrapment. It was entrapment, but and then we cut to Frank, and he talks about how he's under trial, and they say they're trying to get me for bribery and some other things I don't remember. And there's a little writing on the screen that says the other things I don't remember were actually pretty serious crimes, murder, attempted murder, arson, and all this stuff. So I think that's a great example of how he is not a reliable narrator. And if he is not a reliable narrator, then that further propels the film and this idea of the creation of artifice. So you have this idea of the unreliable narrator, you have this idea of the CGI that creates this almost duality of realism and unreality. And then you also have this idea of the film and its backdrop against history. And if for those of you who know this history or have read up on the background of Hoffa and the disappearance of Hoffa and what actually happened, and Joe Gallo and what actually happened there, and what might have actually happened versus what is being depicted through Frank Sheeran's narration as shown in the film as what happened, for example, with these events, as well as the connections with the Kennedys and the Kennedy administration and all this stuff, etc., etc. I mean, Howard Hunt is there. We see David Ferry for a brief moment there, and all this. And incidentally, before I continue, I just love the moment where it was Russell Buffalino, Joe Pesci, who is giving Frank the orders to go to drive the truck from Baltimore, to Florida. We understand that the implication being that the truck is filled with a lot of weapons that we understand, or we can assume were weapons that were relied upon as part of the either as part of some kind of aspect of what became the Bay of Pigs. So, and there's a great moment where Russell says, you're going to meet David Ferry. And I don't know if you know the film JFK from the early 90s, Oliver Stone, but if you know that film, you'll recall that actually Joe Pesci appears in the film JFK, and wouldn't you know it, he plays David Ferry in the film JFK. So it's really funny to hear Russell Buffalino, played by Joe Pesci, talking about David Ferry, who was portrayed by Joe Pesci in an earlier film called JFK. I thought that was a really neat moment. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but it was a really neat moment. But just going back to my earlier point, right, which is this idea of these depictions of things in history that may or may not have happened is also, I think, a wider element of this idea or feeling of artifice that the film universe, I think, is creating. And so, and I think it's okay to feel that way. It's okay to feel this, watch this film and feel like it feels to be artificial, or feels like cut out of the cloth of artifice, if you will. I think that's not a negative of the film. I think that is a very positive thing, because it goes into, I think, what Scorsese has been talking about in some interviews with respect to the, right, which is this idea of does it really matter if Frank shot Joe Gallo, etc. If you recall, Scorsese has been seen on camera asked about this, these things that are being shown in the film, and his answer is, I think, very appropriately vague. But if I can paraphrase and recalling from memory, it might not be that accurate, but I urge you to check them out on YouTube or something if you can find them. But Scorsese is talking about these moments, and I'm paraphrasing, but if I recall, he says, does it really matter if Frank really shot Joe Gallo or not? I mean, it's all about the emotions of the characters as they're feeling, and they're human beings. That's what Scorsese says, and they have emotions, and they are feeling based on these experiences that they're having. And so I think we can therefore look at these moments and not take them at face value, but we can if I suppose we want to, although I don't think that's the point of the film. At least that doesn't feel like that's the point of the film for me. It feels like there is something along the lines of what I'm trying to express, and what I admit to be a very poor way of expressing it, perhaps. But it's this idea of the creation of artifice. And if we can connect that somehow to the idea of old age and the effects of time, and looking back on one's life and thinking about the regrets that one has, or thinking about the loss that one has experienced through choices that one has made over one's lifetime, and also coupling that with this idea of impending death, then I think we can see, therefore, this idea coming to the fray, that maybe Frank as a character is looking back in a way that is maybe denying what he actually did, maybe trying to use the artifice of memory as a way to protect himself. He does have some kind of feeling of guilt, that's for sure, by the end. I mean, when he is an old man, he says out loud when he's talking to the priest, remember, how could he have made that phone call, right? And we understand that he was referring to the phone call that he made to Jimmy Hoffa's wife, right after he killed Jimmy Hoffa. And so it's a famous scene of the film, I think, already, and I want to get to that in a second. But so we understand that even in his old age he is feeling guilt, but he is also looking back. And also, I would suggest that he is not necessarily repentant, or he is not necessarily shown to be fully regretful of all of the quote-unquote bad choices in his life. I would suggest that, remember his two examples of this. So the first is the killing of Sally Bugs. If you remember, he's the guy with the glasses, Chucky, and when they're driving that final fateful day, taking Jimmy Hoffa to the house where he would be killed, right? And they have that discussion about the fish. What fish did Chucky get? How could he buy a fish and not know what fish it was, and all that stuff, which is another interesting part of the film. Hopefully I'll get to that in a second as well. But remember, he was killed very violently by Frank and one other person, point blank and shot in the face. It's really quite interesting. Not interesting. It's really quite gruesome, actually, how that happened. It's interesting in the sense that, if you recall earlier, when we first see Sally Bugs at the very beginning, when he is garroting, it was Tony Three Fingers in the car there, and it has a shot of his face, and it says, he gets killed with gunshots to the face. This is actually an interesting thing. Remember, throughout the film, we see these little moments of people being introduced, and then we get these little cards up on the screen saying that how they died, usually in very violent circumstances. Well, I think Sally Bugs is the only character. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but he is probably the only character, or one of the only characters anyway, that is shown with one of these cards early on in the film, and then later in the same film we actually see what actually happened, that the death of that character, which was depicted earlier in these sort of cards. We don't see this for any of the other characters like Angelo, Bruno, etc., but we do see this for Sally Bugs. And also, if you recall, his death, which was, we understand, ordered by Russell Buffalino in a very creepy, chilling way, about how Sally Bugs was seen walking into the FBI offices, and he didn't say anything to anyone, so it was probably nothing, but why would you go there and not say anything to anyone? And then it was found out later that he did actually say something to someone, but they forgot to say something, and so he was shot. And it was, as Frank said, I think he said it was a bad hit. So it was a mistake. It was a mistake. And also, there's a moment when Joe Gallo was killed. If you recall, there's that whole setup and about what guns Frank decides to use, and also the idea of he would be in the restaurant with his family, his bodyguard and his wife, and his family would be there. And Frank says, it was better that they be there and see it. That was the point of it, which is a really frightening way to put it, right? And so these two examples are not things that we see Frank lamenting late in his life. He is lamenting the loss of his daughter, Peggy. He's lamenting the death of Jimmy Hoffa, but that seems to be about it. We don't see him lamenting any other, or regretting any other bad actions that he might have taken in the film. So I can look at that and say that perhaps Frank is not fully repentant, or he's not fully regretful as one might think he should be in the grand scheme of things. And so perhaps that also helps with the argument that the film The Irishman is almost like a creation of artifice that is, in a psychological and emotional way, consistent with Frank's psychology at the point where he is an old man late in the film. Just to cap off the discussion here, because I don't want to go too long here, but I do want to mention a few things that I also found very, very interesting indeed. I must say that Al Pacino was so great in this. I thought he was really, really great, and I loved his casting, because there was almost a self-reflective moment, if you recall, during the Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night scene, which I think is the highlight of the film in many ways. I think that's to me the scene of the film. It's very much like the wedding scene in Godfather or something. Everything is going on in that scene. I think Jimmy Hoffa's fate was sealed in that scene. It was probably sealed during the discussion that Jimmy Hoffa was having with Russell Buffalino, which is now, to me, one of those great scenes in a film that has a lot of great scenes, but that has the line now that was in the first trailer that I so love, which is Russell Buffalino says, some people, not me, but some people think that you might be failing, you might be demonstrating a failure to show appreciation. I love that. Some people, not me. That's so perfect. It's like, I don't know what to call it. Feels like mafia speak, if you will. Some people, not me. It probably means Russell. And he says, you might be demonstrating a failure to show appreciation. That is like that almost feels like a kiss of death, if you will. And that's the moment. And then when Jimmy Hoffa explodes at that and said, I went to school for 5 years, which means that he was in jail he was incarcerated for nearly 5 years, and so he didn't name names, and he had to put up with Tony Pro, who bothered him with all his problems when all he wanted to do was eat his ice cream in peace and all that stuff, and you could see the look on Joe Pesci's face. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it was like in that moment you already made the decision, probably. So it's really I love that scene, and the scene between Frank and Jimmy is also so wonderful. It's just got a lot of heart in it, where Frank delivers the message from Russell, and he says it is what it is, which is, again, immediately, it's so wonderful. This is wonderful mafia speak in a way, and it's so great also that Jimmy Hoffa immediately understands what this means, and you notice it. He says, "They wouldn't dare, they wouldn't dare." So he knows it means that it means death, and even when he gets the message, he still doesn't back down. Nobody threatens Hoffa, as he says earlier. But I love this when he says, when Frank is trying to appease him, or just trying to calm him down, saying, just talk to Russell. It's better if you talk to him. And Jimmy sort of has a change of heart and says, I'm so sorry. I kind of blew up at him earlier, but I do that. I blow my top or something like that. And so I love that. That feels like a bit of self-reflexivity almost in the way Al Pacino is known as a performer, because he's known for his bombastic scenes, and he's got quite a few here as well. But I love it also just for the quiet moments. The quiet moments, I think, are really so great. When he's together in the hotel room with Frank, and he's talking about Fitz, and Frank is giving his first glimpses of doubt with respect to Fitz, and in fact Frank ends up being right, because Fitzsimmons and Hoffa become rivals in terms after Hoffa gets released from prison. But also there's a moment where Hoffa asks Frank, you should run for this union election here, and he agrees, and he goes, you could see that he's so happy, Jimmy Hoffa, and it's just great. Stress has been relieved, and he's just going, and he just leans his head back on the bedpost and just goes to sleep. It's such a charming, lovable moment. The same is true also when we see Hoffa and his interactions with Peggy, Frank's daughter, and ice cream, and he gets the 2 ice creams, and these are just for the 2 of us, and that sort of thing. It's really charming. I love those charming quiet moments that Al Pacino gives to this character, even more so than the huge, loud, bombastic moments. And those are great, don't get me wrong. I also love that moment when he explodes at all the people in his office, and Frank is there as well, and then Frank leaves the office and he says, I quit, because he's so offended that he thought that Hoffa was attacking him with those same insults, and he said, no, I didn't mean you, I was talking to them, I didn't know you were in the room, and all that wonderful stuff. They're like kids just arguing and misunderstanding each other, and it's great. And I love that childish element, almost not child, but childlike element that Pacino brings to this. It's so great, and I think that's what gives him this. That's almost what helps me understand these huge mistakes that Hoffa's obviously making towards the latter half of the film, which leads to his doom. He didn't back down from the way he felt about Tony Pro. He didn't back down about the way he felt about getting back into the union. This is my union, he always says. And, about meeting people, he was so stubborn. It's what Frank says, he's a knucklehead. And so, but the way that Pacino humanizes him with this childlike innocence almost, this odd naivete in a strange way, I think that's what gives Hoffa a really likable charm about him, even though he is also he is a man of questionable ethics as depicted in the film. So that's really great. The one of the other standouts, of course, is Joe Pesci. Joe Pesci, wow. There are so many fantastic moments, just too many to recount here. But I love the look on his face, first of all, when he is showing disappointment and just this, not rage, but this cool demeanor that is showing this really powerful and frightening human being. No wonder Peggy, who has this wonderful sixth sense about her, no wonder she was almost repulsed by this person, even when she was young, because he is a very repulsive human being in many respects. He is shown also to be a kind of quiet, kind person, right? You look how strong I made you, when he gives him one of only 3 rings, right, and to Frank, right? And so he has this lovable aspect, of course, but also he is a cold-blooded killer in many respects. And so the way that Joe Pesci portrays this character is astounding, and you don't need me to say that. There are already plenty of critics out there who are already lauding his performance, rightly so. Just looks alone are really very brilliant, and I love also the quiet moments, the way in which his face registers emotion or lack thereof, seeming lack thereof, after, for instance, that run-in with Joe Gallo on his birthday, and they're at the show with Don Rickles there. And you go back to Joe Pesci's face, and you see his face, and that's where the decision was made, etc. And then we see his look as he's watching the TV, and the Bay of Pigs news on TV. He's got this sort of tired look on his face, but he just, he kind of knew that was going to happen, perhaps, I'm not sure, but those are such great moments. And but I go back to the Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night. That whole dialogue between him and Al Pacino is just gold for me, and I really value that scene very much. Then there is Robert De Niro. Robert De Niro, I think, gives a really difficult performance here. I think he's meant to be, in many ways, he's not meant to be the most intelligent person in the bunch. And we see this early on, where he seems to be being manipulated by whispers and the Cadillac linen and all that stuff. And then therefore, before he goes in and actually blows the place up, he is called in by Russell and Angela Bruno there. And that leads to that wonderful scene late at night in the empty restaurant between Harvey Keitel and Joe Pesci's there, but it's really Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro on the two of them, and Harvey Keitel's revealing, actually, I own a share in that place that you're planning to destroy, and so, who put you up to it? And said, now's not the time to say, right? And that's a great moment, because that dialogue reminded me a lot of the dialogue scenes that were had between Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro in Mean Streets. I mean, there's a lot of comedy dialogue in Mean Streets, and the dialogue scene here in The Irishman between Keitel and De Niro has that same flavor of dialogue. You know, there's a moment where do you know who owns, I'm paraphrasing, but do you know who owns the rest of that linen business? And De Niro says no. And then Keitel says, I do. And then De Niro interprets that to mean I do means, oh, I know who owns it. And so De Niro says, so who? And then Keitel says, no, I do. As in, it's not I do meaning I know who owns it. I do means I own it. So that's what I love, that little almost comic touch that exists between the two of them, and it reminded me a lot of the comic touches that existed in their dialogue scenes in Mean Streets. You know, that whole thing about Johnny Boy, and he had to give money back. He owed a lot of money. So. Wonderful. But Robert De Niro gives a performance that I think is encapsulated by what happens after the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, and it's done in two very key ways in that respect. First is the telephone call scene that he gives to Hoffa's wife, where he is it's just a shot of him on its face. There's an interesting thing that there's an edit, which is a little bit of an interesting. It seems to be almost a French New Wave type of edit, and it goes into the cut at the actual conversation itself. So it reminds me a lot of Taxi Driver in that interesting Nouvelle Vague style of filmmaking. It also reminds me of Taxi Driver too, because in that film, if you recall, there is a very key moment where De Niro is on the phone. In that film, he was trying to reconnect with Betsy, the Sybil Shepherd character, and he was on the phone, and it's a very famous shot where it goes into a hallway. Here we have a similar sort of thing where we have De Niro on the phone talking with another woman. The circumstances are slightly different, right? In Taxi Driver, he was trying to make a connection, but unsuccessful in that attempt. Here, it's almost like he's trying to deflect what it is he has actually done. So in an interesting way, it's a reversal of Taxi Driver. It's the same situation of a telephone call to another woman on the other end of the line there, but the difference being is, whereas one film he's trying to make a connection, in another film it's almost like he's trying to deflect from what is actually happening. So in an interesting sense, he's trying to destroy a connection. So I love that reversal. So it's like we have key scenes in both films involving a phone call made by De Niro to another person. It's brilliant. And this scene, I think, is just heartbreaking on so many levels. And then that heartbreak is carried through in a very operatic way with the final act of the film, which is Frank Sheeran in old age. The effects of time and age have really done a number on Sheeran. It's done a number too on Fat Tony Solero, and also we see the effects on Russell Bufalino quite strikingly so. It's an interesting situation here with the two characters. I mean, that scene with the two of them, it's talking about the grape juice, and you see the shaking hand, the right hand of Russell Bufalino, and he doesn't have teeth, so he can't have a big piece of bread. So he's struggling just to suck the juice from the moist bread. And then suddenly he decides. This is the moment where he talks about Jimmy Hoffa. Which is an interesting thing. I don't think it's necessarily a reflection of reality, because you would think that of all the things that he has done in his life, the last thing he would probably want to do at this moment is talk about Jimmy Hoffa. It feels a little bit forced in that sense, but at the same time, if we were to think of this part of the film as a kind of Shakespearean operatic tragic act, then the bringing up of this element, I think, makes perfect sense in this narrative. And also it lends itself very nicely to what I was suggesting earlier about the creation of artifice. But the point here is that the effects of time and age and immorality, perhaps, or the lack of morality, has really done a number on these people. And certainly it's done a number on Frank. So, and the performance here by Deniro is just, I think, outstanding, absolutely outstanding. I think there are some weaknesses in the film, and I should say that I think the biggest weakness of the film is the relationship between Frank and Peggy. This relationship, I don't think, was given enough attention in the film for me to feel the fullness of the impact of the loss of Peggy from Frank's life. And the reason I say this is because I never got the sense that I felt that there was enough of a connection between Frank and Peggy during their life. It was almost like Peggy from the outset had always been distant from her father, So there was never any feeling of what Peggy's life was or what she was going through. It was just her observing her father when she was younger, and then when she was a young woman. So I never got the sense of the importance of that relationship in Frank's life. Now, that could have been by design, who knows? But I would just gently remind one of, for instance, the relationships in Goodfellas and Casino. We had Karen in Goodfellas, and we had Ginger in Casino. And I thought those, I mean, we could say also that in those films too, the female characters are obviously sidelined in favor of the male characters and the story that's being told. And I think that's true very, very obviously here in The Irishman. I wouldn't necessarily call that in and of itself a criticism of the film. Don't get me wrong. I don't think that in and of itself is a criticism of the film. But where I think Goodfellas and Casino succeeded, where The Irishman probably feels a little bit underdeveloped, is the fact that I felt like we got glimpses into Karen's perspective. I felt like we got glimpses into Ginger's perspective and what she was going through, and her feelings on this relationship that she had with Ace, right? I never got the sense of Peggy's perspective necessarily. I never knew what her life was about. I didn't know what I only knew that she had a disapproval, or I could assume that she had a disapproving view of her father's life, but that was all I could glean from that. I couldn't get a sense anything further of her. It was only her from the not point of view, but it was only her as it related to her father. It was never her on her own terms, if you know what I mean. With Karen in Goodfellas, I felt we could get a little bit of her on her own terms. With Ginger in Casino, I felt we could get a little bit of her on her own terms. Not with Peggy here, unfortunately. So I think that's not a failing of the actors who are portraying Peggy. I don't think that's a failing at all. I think especially Anna Paquin does a really fine job in that moment when she almost confronts her father, saying, "Why didn't you call Joe?" And that's where she knows that he did it, right? But I think without anything more from Peggy's perspective, I think it's difficult for me to fully appreciate the impact that the absence of this relationship has on Frank in his final years. So that's what I would call the biggest weakness of the film, and I think for me it feels a little bit underdeveloped. It's a very long film already, but I wouldn't mind seeing maybe a good 15, 20 minutes or 30 minutes more to the film devoted to the Peggy character in some capacity. I mean, I think at the very end, when we had the priest leaving the room and that very final shot, we actually see a moment where the priest leaves and he leaves the door open. We can see a little bit of the nightstand by the bed. I think we can see a picture. It's Peggy, Anna Paquin, Peggy. But so obviously And obviously, we are meant to understand that Peggy is a big part of Frank's life, but I'm sorry to say that for me, it was something that I didn't quite latch on to as much as I would have liked to. And I understand that the film was trying to portray that, because we could tell that that was one of the main components of the feeling of loss that Frank is meant to have experienced in the final act of the film. So I should mention just a few other things too, just in passing. There's, of course, that great theme, Robbie Robertson theme, with that sort of slow harmonica lament, which is great because there's a link, of course, with Scorsese past filmography in The Last Waltz, right? There's also the great scene where De Niro is talking on the phone with Pacino as they're on their way to Detroit, right, for Bill Buffalino's daughter's wedding. And it's that final attempt at rapprochement between Hoffa and the mafia, but it really turns out to be no good, because even at that moment, Hoffa refuses to meet with Tony Pro in person. So it's, you've got to meet. That's what I can't do it. And we see Hoffa sitting there by the lake, on this chair. I love that shot because it reminded me so much of Godfather Part 2. If you know that film, you know that there's some scenes that happen near the lake there, Lake Tahoe, I think, and Michael is talking with Fredo. And I love, there's a very famous scene in that film where Michael's talking to Fredo, and we see the lake in the background because they're talking like a kind of a boathouse type of thing, the glass. And Fredo's sitting there in this sort of stretched out chair, and he's being portrayed in almost a very sympathetic, almost pathetic way. Well, it's very interesting to see Pacino here in The Irishman sitting in a similar posture by a lake, which is very similar to how Fredo was sitting in Godfather Part 2, and any further parallels one might make between Fredo and Hoffa might make for interesting conversation going forward. But that might be for another day, my friends. But that's interesting. And gosh, there are so many other interesting things here that are worth mentioning. There are some just quite moments there. I think it's a very quiet film in that it's very slow and methodical. I bring your attention to, of course, the scenes with Pesci and De Niro eating breakfast and Howard Johnson. What cereal you have? Total. You just see him putting the Total in the bowl there. It's very quiet like this, but a lot is happening with the dialogue. I love how the quiet scenes are packed with such innuendo-filled dialogue, if you know what I mean, which is just brilliant. I think the dialogue scenes for me are what makes this film really great. And I love how the film takes its time. Case in point, the whole sequence involving the death of Hoffa, it really takes its time from this step to this step to this step to this step. And even in between, it just takes its time, all the way down to that really odd, almost comic scene involving what kind of fish did Chucky buy? So, and I think the whole point is that it's almost so unbelievable. It's just funny in an interesting way. So I love how the film takes its time, and it feels therefore like a different film from Casino or Goodfellas on the one hand. However, on the other hand, there are certain moments of flourish and bravura. There are like the assassination on Anastasia in what is it, the Sheraton Hotel, the barber shop there in Manhattan, and it's that one continuous take, and it follows the one of the guys out in the barbershop walking out, and it then picks up the two gentlemen the two hitmen really walking from the steps, and then follows them back into the barbershop, and then goes to the flowers, and then you hear the shots, and then it cuts to the I think the actual pictures of that shooting, or the aftermath of the shooting. There's also a very interesting shot happening at the very end, where you have the nurse looking after Frank, walking out of Frank's room. We follow her down the hall, and it's obviously daytime when she's looking after him. And then the same shot, it turns around back down the hallway, back into Frank's room. But then when it makes that turn, it becomes night within the same shot, and then everything is dark and quiet. So it goes from day to night within the same swooping shot, which is an amazing thing. It's really amazing. So it feels like there are flourishes of like nouvelle vague brilliance in a film that is very methodical. It takes its time from point A to point B to point C. It knows where it's going, and it's like, it's like what Hoffa says, and I'm paraphrasing. You have to go, you get from point A from point B, but sometimes you spill a little beer along the way. So it feels something like that. Incidentally, speaking of beer, I love and I didn't know about this because I was living in the U.S., and maybe by the time I was a kid, Lums was already out of business, I suppose. So I never knew about Lums, but the whole idea of after Hoffa is released from jail, the first thing he asks Frank to do is to get him some chili dogs from Lums, and he gives the explanation how they were the best because they steamed them in beer. Oh, those look really good. I've never had one of those, but if I ever have a chance, I'd love to have a beer-steamed chili dog one of these days. But okay, so I suppose that is a good place for me to just wind down this very meandering discussion, I suppose, on my thoughts of the film, The Irishman, with some spoilers there. So I don't think it's a perfect film, and I think it's a film that I have to consider more and more as I myself grow older with the film. It does feel, in many ways, like a testament to this genre of film. It feels like almost like and I mean this in a positive way, almost like a death knell to Scorsese's take on this world that he is associated with, for better or for worse, right? He's associated with because he has made a number of films in his past that have been really famous and are still famous to this day. This does feel in many ways like the end of that journey. Because the final statement and the final shot in a lot of ways feels to me like a definitive final statement on this, and I cannot see where Scorsese can go with this genre anyway. Of course, Scorsese makes other films other than this genre. So, but as far as this goes, if we should think of his works in this particular genre as a sort of a progression, all the way back from Who's That Knocking at My Door, and then Mean Streets, and then we go maybe tangentially to Raging Bull, but definitely more directly to Goodfellas and then Casino, and then now to this film. It feels like if this were a progression of a statement or a collection of statements that Scorsese were making on this topic, then I think the finality of the final shot in The Irishman leads one to the conclusion that this is his ultimate statement on the film, and if so, he ends it on an operatic note of just ultimate spiritual destruction. And my goodness, what a weighty way to end, and I think what a fitting way to end. It seems to be something that in many ways we have seen glimpses of in his early works, but there is a certain sense of poetic finality here that is really quite genius. So that is The Irishman. So my friends, again, my apologies for the meandering nature of this. I hope you can forgive me. If you have any thoughts or comments, of course, please feel free to leave them down below. I would love to hear what it is you have to say. So until we meet again, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well. And please, please, please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, cheers.